The champagne glass never left Dean Martin's hand, but the smile disappeared from his face the moment Jeffrey Epstein said the words that would destroy him. It was November 1987, in the marble-floored ballroom of David O. Selznick's Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by 300 of Hollywood's most powerful figures, when the Wall Street broker made his final threat: "Come to my island party next month, or I'll make sure you never get another recording contract in this town." Dean looked at Jeffrey for a long, silent moment, then set his champagne down with deliberate precision. What Dean said next didn't just end Jeffrey's social standing, it exposed a Caribbean empire built on corruption, coercion, and human trafficking that would send shockwaves through both Hollywood and Wall Street for decades. The Selznick mansion glittered like a jewel against the November night, its windows blazing with warm yellow light that spilled across manicured lawns and gleaming luxury cars. Inside, the elite of entertainment and finance mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, the air thick with expensive perfume, Cuban cigar smoke, and the subtle tension that always accompanied gatherings where fortunes could be made or lost with a handshake. Diamond necklaces caught the light as women in designer gowns moved like elegant ghosts between men in perfectly tailored tuxedos, all of them playing the eternal Hollywood game of power, influence, and carefully concealed desperation. Jeffrey Epstein commanded attention wherever he went, not through charisma, but through the raw magnetism of extreme wealth. At 42, he was the kind of man who measured success in offshore accounts and private islands, his tanned face bearing the perpetual smugness of someone who believed money could buy anything, including people. Jeffrey had built his fortune through a Manhattan investment firm that specialized in discretionary accounts for clients who valued privacy over legality. His Caribbean island, purchased 2 years earlier for $7 million, had become legendary among a certain circle of wealthy men who appreciated entertainment that couldn't be found in traditional venues. Dean Martin knew Jeffrey's reputation, had heard the whispered stories in the dark corners of industry parties. The Wall Street broker's monthly gatherings on his private island weren't typical social events. They were elaborate productions featuring very young women who arrived with tears in their eyes and left with cash in their purses, assuming they left at all. The invitations came printed on heavy cream paper, hand-delivered by men in expensive suits, who made it clear that declining wasn't really an option for those who valued their careers. Jeffrey had been pursuing Dean for 8 months, ever since someone had mentioned that the King of Cool's presence would add legitimacy to his island gatherings. The first invitation had arrived in March, followed by increasingly insistent follow-ups, accompanied by subtle reminders of Jeffrey's connections to record labels, television networks, and casino owners. When Dean continued to ignore the invitations, Jeffrey had begun making personal appearances at industry events, each encounter more aggressive than the last. Dean Martin doesn't associate with human traffickers. Dean had told his manager after learning the details of Jeffrey's island operation through Frank Sinatra's connections to federal law enforcement. The FBI had been watching Jeffrey for months, building a case that would require testimony from someone with credibility and courage. Dean had already decided he would provide both when the time came, but he hadn't anticipated that Jeffrey would force a confrontation in such a public venue. The tension between them had been building all evening. Jeffrey had positioned himself strategically near the bar, intercepting Dean whenever he moved through the crowd, his conversation becoming increasingly pointed as the night progressed. Each interaction had drawn more attention from nearby guests, who sensed the undercurrent of hostility without understanding its source. "Dean, you're being unreasonable," Jeffrey had said during their third encounter, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "It's just a party, successful men celebrating success. You'd enjoy the relaxation." Dean had smiled, that trademark smile, the one that never reached his eyes when he was angry. "Jeffrey, I've got all the relaxation I need right here in Beverly Hills. Thanks anyway." But Jeffrey wasn't a man who accepted rejection gracefully. His fortune had been built on identifying what people wanted: money, fame, protection, silence, and providing it in exchange for compliance. Dean Martin's refusal to be bought represented a challenge to Jeffrey's fundamental worldview, a suggestion that some things couldn't be purchased at any price. The final confrontation began near the mansion's grand piano, where Dean had been talking quietly with Sammy Davis Jr., about upcoming recording plans. Jeffrey approached with two companions, a studio executive and a casino owner, both men whose businesses depended on Jeffrey's financial backing. "Dean, we need to settle this thing between us," Jeffrey announced, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. "You've been avoiding my invitations for months. It's becoming embarrassing." Dean turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Jeffrey, I thought I'd been pretty clear. I'm not interested in your parties." "Why?" Jeffrey demanded, stepping closer, the alcohol on his breath mixed with expensive cologne to create an odor that perfectly captured his personality. Expensive but corrupting. "What makes you think you're better than the rest of us?" The conversations around them had stopped completely now. 20, 30 people were listening, their faces showing the fascination that always accompanied the scent of scandal. "I never said I was better than anyone," Dean replied quietly. "I just choose my company carefully." Jeffrey's face flushed red, the practiced charm evaporating to reveal the rage underneath. "You know what your problem is, Martin. You think you're untouchable. You think your little rat pack friends protect you from real power." Dean's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained level. "Jeffrey, you're drunk. Maybe I should what?" Jeffrey interrupted, his voice rising. "Maybe I should remind you that I own significant shares in 3 record labels that distribute your albums. Maybe I should mention that the casino chain that books your Vegas shows depends on my investment group for financing." The crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Dean could see Frank Sinatra moving through the crowd toward them, but Dean held up a subtle hand to stop him. This was going to end here, tonight, in front of witnesses. "Is that a threat, Jeffrey?" Dean asked, his voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. Jeffrey smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "It's reality. Business reality. You come to my party next month, you enjoy the hospitality, you take some photographs with the other guests, and your career continues unchanged. You keep playing this moral superiority game, and I guarantee you'll find it very difficult to get recording contracts, television bookings, or casino dates." The silence that followed was absolute. 300 of Hollywood's most powerful figures waited to see how Dean Martin would respond to being threatened in public by one of New York's most connected financiers. Dean looked at Jeffrey for a long moment, then at the crowd of faces surrounding them. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean began, his tone conversational but deadly serious. "I'd like you all to meet Jeffrey Epstein, successful Wall Street broker, private island owner, and human trafficker." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. Jeffrey's face went pale, then purple with rage. "You can't," Jeffrey started, but Dean continued. "Jeffrey's been inviting me to his monthly parties on his Caribbean island. Not the kind of parties you'd want your daughters attending. The kind where very young women arrive against their will and leave traumatized, assuming they leave at all." Jeffrey was backing away now, his companions looking around desperately for an exit, but Dean wasn't finished. "See, Jeffrey operates under the assumption that everyone has a price, that everyone can be bought, threatened, or coerced into compliance. He's built his entire empire on that theory. His investment firm launders money for people who can't use traditional banks. His island parties provide entertainment that would be illegal in any civilized jurisdiction." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. Several prominent women had moved noticeably away from Jeffrey, their faces showing disgust and fear. "But here's what Jeffrey doesn't understand," Dean continued, his voice getting slightly louder. "Some things aren't for sale. Some people can't be intimidated, and some secrets are too important to keep quiet just to protect a career." Jeffrey found his voice, though it came out as a strangled shout. "You're lying. This is slander. You have no proof." "I have photographs," Dean said simply. "I have witness statements. I have financial records showing payments to traffickers in 3 countries. The FBI has been building a case for 8 months, and they asked me to help provide testimony." Jeffrey's legs seemed to give out. He gripped the edge of a nearby table for support, his face now completely white. Dean moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the ballroom. "You want to know why I wouldn't come to your parties, Jeffrey? It's not because I think I'm better than you. It's because I know exactly what you are. You're a coward who preys on the vulnerable. You're a criminal who hides behind expensive suits and political connections. You're everything that's wrong with power without conscience. Dean straightened his tuxedo jacket and looked around at the crowd, most of whom were staring at Jeffrey with a mixture of horror and disgust. As for threatening my career, Dean said with a slight smile, I think you'll find that very difficult to do from federal prison. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Jeffrey Epstein running for the exit, pushing through the crowd like a man fleeing a fire. His two companions followed, leaving behind a ballroom full of stunned witnesses and one unshakable entertainer who had just proven that some principles were worth more than any fortune. Frank Sinatra was the first to move, walking over to put his hand on Dean's shoulder. Jesus, Dean, how long have you been carrying this around? Long enough to make sure I had the facts straight, Dean replied, picking up his champagne glass from the piano where he'd left it. Too long to let it continue. The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, as people processed what they'd witnessed, several studio executives and casino owners looked visibly shaken. They would need to review their own connections to Jeffrey's investment group. Within hours, the story would be all over Hollywood, and by morning, it would reach Wall Street. Jeffrey Epstein never made it back to New York. Federal agents arrested him at Los Angeles International Airport 6 hours later, armed with the witness statements and financial evidence that Dean had helped provide. The investigation that followed exposed a network of corruption stretching from Caribbean islands to Manhattan boardrooms, involving dozens of wealthy men who had believed their money made them untouchable. The trials lasted 2 years. Jeffrey received 25 years in federal prison, though he would serve only 2. Dean Martin's career, far from being destroyed by his confrontation with Jeffrey, reached new heights. The public response to his moral courage was overwhelmingly positive. Record sales increased, concert bookings multiplied, and his television show achieved its highest ratings. More importantly, his action had sent a message through both Hollywood and Wall Street that some people couldn't be intimidated into silence. Years later, when asked about that night at the Selznick mansion, Dean would simply say, "Some things are more important than show business. Some fights are worth having, regardless of the cost." The lesson of November 1987 wasn't about the entertainment industry or Wall Street corruption, though it involved both. It was about the moment when a man must choose between personal safety and moral obligation. It was about the recognition that silence in the face of evil makes you complicit in that evil. Jeffrey Epstein had built his empire on the assumption that everyone had a price, that sufficient pressure could make anyone compromise their principles. He discovered, in the marble-floored ballroom of a Beverly Hills mansion, that some people are simply not for sale. Dean Martin had faced down mob bosses, studio executives, and difficult audiences throughout his career. But the night he exposed Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking operation, he proved that the King of Cool was also a man of unshakable principle. Some performances happen on stage, under bright lights, for applause and money. The most important ones happen in ballrooms, under crystal chandeliers, for justice and the protection of the innocent. In the end, Jeffrey Epstein learned what Dean Martin had always known, that true power comes not from what you can take from others, but from what you're willing to sacrifice for what's right. And that night in Beverly Hills, surrounded by the elite of 2 powerful industries, Dean Martin showed them all what real strength looks like. November 1987, Beverly Hills. In the glittering ballroom of David O. Selznick's mansion, a Wall Street broker made the mistake of threatening Dean Martin's career. Jeffrey Kellerman thought his offshore millions and Caribbean island empire made him untouchable, until the King of Cool exposed the dark truth behind his wealth. This is the untold story of how a finance broker's exclusive parties on his private island weren't celebrations, but something far more sinister. When Jeffrey's months of persistent invitations turned into public blackmail, Dean Martin faced a choice: protect his career or protect innocent lives. The Beverly Hills confrontation that followed didn't just end Jeffrey Kellerman's social standing. It exposed a trafficking network stretching from Caribbean hideaways to Manhattan boardrooms. With FBI evidence in hand, Dean Martin turned a Hollywood party into a courtroom, delivering justice in front of 300 witnesses. Jeffrey had built his fortune believing everyone had a price. He discovered that night that some principles aren't for sale, and some men can't be bought at any cost. The champagne glasses stopped clinking when Dean Martin proved that true power comes from moral courage, not offshore accounts. In this video, Jeffrey Kellerman's sinister Caribbean island parties and trafficking operation, the 8-month campaign to force Dean Martin's participation, Beverly Hills ballroom showdown that exposed Wall Street corruption, how Dean's testimony helped the FBI destroy a criminal empire. Subscribe to discover the hidden moments when Hollywood legends chose justice over self-preservation, and learn why some confrontations echo through decades of entertainment history.